The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune as 6-year-old Lucy Chen pressed her small face against the cold glass of the hospital window, watching the snow fall like tiny dancers in the parking lot below. Her mother had been in that sterile room for 3 weeks now, connected to machines that beeped and whirred with mechanical precision, and Lucy had learned to find comfort in the strangest places. Tonight, it was in the gentle movements of a man in navy blue coveralls who was carefully salting the walkways outside, making sure no one would slip on the ice that had formed during the evening freeze. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The man moved with purpose but without hurry, checking each step, each corner, each entrance where people might walk in the morning. Something about his methodical care reminded Lucy of how her mommy used to check her bedroom at night, making sure everything was safe and perfect before tucking her in. When he looked up and noticed her small silhouette in the window, he didn't wave or smile like most adults did when they saw children. Instead, he simply nodded, a gesture of acknowledgement that somehow felt more genuine than forced cheerfulness, and continued his work with the same quiet dedication. Lucy had been staying with her father David in their big house on Cedar Hills, but every evening they came to the hospital, and every evening she found herself drawn to that same window, watching for the man who made things safe for everyone else. Her daddy was always on his phone during these visits, speaking in hushed tones about business deals and appointments that couldn't wait, even here in this place where time seemed suspended and normal life felt impossibly distant. But the man outside never talked on a phone, never seemed rushed or distracted, never acted like he had somewhere more important to be than right here, doing this necessary work that kept people safe. The morning alarm pierced through the thin walls of Mountain View Apartments at precisely 5:30, just as it had every weekday for the past 2 years. Michael Torres silenced it quickly, listening for any sound from the adjacent bedroom where his 7-year-old daughter Emma still slept peacefully, her breathing steady and unlabored in the way that only children could manage. The early hour was necessary, not just for his custodial duties at Pine Street Elementary, but for the careful orchestration required to manage single parenthood on a maintenance worker's salary in a town where the cost of living seemed to rise with each passing month. Michael moved through his morning routine with the precision of someone who had learned that efficiency was survival, that every minute saved in the morning meant more time with Emma in the evening, more opportunities to help with homework or simply listen to her describe the small adventures that filled a second grader's day. He prepared her lunch with the same attention to detail he brought to his work, ensuring she had both nutrition and something special, a handwritten note tucked beside her sandwich that would remind her she was loved even when they were apart. The job at Pine Street Elementary had been a godsend when he'd moved to Millbrook 2 years ago, seeking a fresh start in a place where nobody knew about Grace's accident or the months of grief that had nearly broken him completely. The position came with decent benefits, enough to cover Emma's needs and their modest rent, and the schedule allowed him to be present for the important moments in his daughter's life. He took pride in keeping the school spotless and safe, understanding that his work created the environment where children learned and grew, where teachers could focus on education rather than worrying about broken fixtures or dirty floors. The elementary school where he worked was different from the one Emma attended, a deliberate choice he'd made to maintain some separation between his professional and personal lives, to give his daughter space to be herself without the complication of having her father's workplace become part of her daily experience. Emma attended Riverside Elementary on the other side of town, a newer facility with better resources that served the mixed population of working families and the growing number of tech professionals who had discovered Millbrook's combination of small-town charm and proximity to larger urban centers. Michael's day began before sunrise with a thorough inspection of Pine Street Elementary, checking each classroom, hallway, and common area for anything that might pose a safety hazard or distraction to the learning environment. He took particular care with the kindergarten and first grade classrooms, understanding that younger children were more vulnerable to environmental factors, more likely to be affected by poor air quality or inadequate lighting. His attention to detail had earned him the respect of the teaching staff, who had learned to trust that he would notice and address problems before they became serious issues. The teachers often commented on how the school seemed to run more smoothly since Michael's arrival, how minor maintenance issues were resolved before they could disrupt classes, how the building always felt welcoming and well cared for. Principal Margaret Wilson had mentioned more than once that she wished all her staff members approached their work with Michael's level of dedication and professionalism, that his quiet competence had become something the entire school community had come to rely on without even realizing it. Between his regular cleaning duties, he had taken on additional responsibilities that technically fell outside his job description, but which he performed anyway because he saw the need and had the skills to help. He repaired playground equipment during lunch breaks, ensuring that children could play safely without the district having to wait weeks for official maintenance crews. He maintained the school garden that the third-grade classes used for their science projects, understanding that hands-on learning experiences were precious and shouldn't be compromised by administrative delays or budget constraints. The work was physically demanding but emotionally satisfying in ways that his previous career in construction had never been. Here, his efforts directly supported children's education and well-being, creating an environment where learning could flourish and teachers could focus on their calling rather than worrying about infrastructure problems. He had found purpose in service, meaning in work that others might consider menial, but which he understood to be fundamental to the entire education enterprise. Emma thrived in their new life in Millbrook, making friends easily and excelling in school. She appreciated the small class sizes and the attention she received from her teachers, who understood the challenges she faced as a child raised by a single father.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Her studies, despite the upheaval of moving and adjusting to life without her mother. She spoke often about her teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, who had helped her feel welcome and confident in her new school, who had recognized her artistic talents and encouraged her to enter a district-wide drawing competition. Emma's pictures now decorated their small apartment, bright splashes of color and imagination that transformed their modest living space into something that felt like home. The single parenting responsibilities had taught Michael to be organized in ways he'd never imagined necessary, to plan meals and activities and schedules with military precision, while still maintaining the flexibility to respond to unexpected needs or opportunities. He had learned to braid hair and paint fingernails, to navigate the complex social dynamics of elementary school friendships, to provide both strength and gentleness in ways that honored Grace's memory while building something new and sustainable for their family of two. Financial security remained a constant concern, requiring careful budgeting and the occasional sacrifice of things he would have preferred to provide for Emma. They couldn't afford the name-brand clothes or expensive activities that some of her classmates enjoyed, but Michael worked hard to ensure that Emma never felt deprived or different because of their economic circumstances. He had learned to find free and low-cost activities that enriched her life, from library story hours to community center art classes, from hiking trails to public swimming pools that provided adventure and education without straining their budget. The Mountain View apartments where they lived were clean and safe, but far from luxurious, filled primarily with other working families who were doing their best to build stable lives in an economy that demanded constant vigilance and effort. Michael had developed friendships with neighbors who understood the challenges of single parenthood, who could be relied upon for emergency childcare, or simply for the adult conversation that helped maintain perspective during difficult periods. The community they'd found wasn't based on wealth or status, but on mutual support and shared values, on the understanding that everyone deserved dignity and respect regardless of their economic circumstances. Michael's evening routine was as carefully structured as his morning preparations, designed to maximize the quality time he could spend with Emma while ensuring that both of them were prepared for the following day. They would review her homework together, not just checking for completion, but discussing what she was learning, connecting her school lessons to the broader world, and helping her develop critical thinking skills that would serve her throughout her life. These conversations had become some of his favorite parts of the day, opportunities to witness his daughter's growing understanding and curiosity, to participate in her intellectual development in ways that felt both natural and profound. Their bedtime ritual included stories and prayers, moments of connection that honored Grace's memory while building new traditions that belonged uniquely to their life together. Emma would talk about her day, sharing both triumphs and concerns with the trust that her father would listen without judgment and offer guidance when appropriate. Michael had learned to recognize the difference between problems that required immediate intervention and those that were simply part of growing up, between situations where his daughter needed solutions and those where she simply needed someone to witness her experience and validate her feelings. The work at Pine Street Elementary provided more than just income and benefits. It offered Michael a sense of contributing to something larger than himself, of playing a vital role in the education and development of hundreds of children who passed through the school's halls each day. He understood that his work was essential to creating an environment where learning could occur, where teachers could teach and children could grow, where education could fulfill its promise of opening doors and expanding possibilities for young minds eager to explore and understand their world. As autumn progressed toward winter in Millbrook, Michael found himself settling into a rhythm that felt sustainable and meaningful, a life built around service and love rather than ambition or material accumulation. The small mountain town had provided them with exactly what they needed, a community where people were valued for their character rather than their achievements, where Emma could grow up safely while learning the values that Grace had considered most important. The future felt manageable, even hopeful, as father and daughter continued building their life together, one ordinary day at a time, creating stability and joy from the simple but profound foundation of unconditional love and mutual commitment. Part 2. The Moral Choice. The emergency call came through the school's intercom system at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon that had started like any other. Michael was in the supply closet organizing cleaning materials when Principal Wilson's voice crackled through the speakers with an urgency that immediately commanded attention. A kindergarten student had suffered what appeared to be a severe allergic reaction during snack time, and the child was experiencing difficulty breathing while they waited for the ambulance to arrive. The teacher was requesting immediate assistance from anyone with medical training or emergency response experience. Michael dropped the industrial-sized bottle of floor cleaner he'd been holding and sprinted toward the kindergarten wing, his mind automatically shifting into the emergency response mode he'd learned during his military service years before Emma was born. The hallway seemed endless as he ran, his work boots echoing against the polished floors he'd cleaned that morning, past classroom doors where teachers were quietly managing their students' curiosity about the commotion while trying to maintain normal routines that would keep everyone calm and focused.
Nailed down beside her, and spoke in the calm, authoritative voice he'd used countless times with wounded soldiers, explaining that he was there to help and that everything was going to be okay. He quickly assessed her condition, noting the classic signs of anaphylactic shock that he'd encountered during his medical training, recognizing that every second counted in a situation where delay could mean the difference between recovery and tragedy. The school nurse whispered that Lucy's emergency medication was in the main office, requiring someone to retrieve her EpiPen while others stayed with the child to monitor her rapidly deteriorating condition. Without hesitation, Michael volunteered to make the run, understanding that his speed and familiarity with the building's layout made him the logical choice for a task that required both urgency and precision. He promised Lucy he would be right back, squeezing her small hand gently before launching himself toward the administrative offices with the single-minded focus of someone who understood that a child's life depended on his efficiency. The main office was in controlled pandemonium as staff members coordinated with emergency services and attempted to contact Lucy's parents, who were both traveling for business and difficult to reach during the critical early moments of the crisis. Michael located Lucy's emergency medical information and grabbed the EpiPen from the locked medical cabinet, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. The secretary was still trying to reach David Chen on his cell phone, leaving increasingly urgent voicemails that described the situation and pleaded for him to call back immediately. Racing back to the kindergarten classroom, Michael found that Lucy's condition had worsened in the brief minutes he'd been gone. Her breathing was now clearly labored, her lips showing the faint blue tinge that indicated oxygen deprivation, her small body fighting a battle against an immune system that had identified a harmless food as a mortal threat. The school nurse accepted the EpiPen gratefully, but then hesitated, explaining that district policy required parental consent before administering emergency medication, even in life-threatening situations where delay could have catastrophic consequences. Michael looked at Lucy's frightened face and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Drawing on his military medical training and his instincts as a father, he gently took the EpiPen from the nurse's trembling hands and explained that he would take full responsibility for administering the medication. The nurse protested weakly, mentioning policies and liability concerns, but Michael was already preparing the auto-injector while speaking calmly to Lucy about what was going to happen and why it would help her feel better. The injection itself took only seconds, but those seconds stretched into an eternity as everyone in the room held their breath and waited for signs of improvement. Michael stayed beside Lucy, monitoring her breathing and pulse while speaking reassuringly about how the medicine was already starting to work, how her body was remembering how to breathe normally, how she was going to be perfectly fine. Gradually, almost miraculously, the medication began to take effect and Lucy's breathing became easier, her color improved, her panic subsided as oxygen once again flowed freely through her system. When the paramedics finally arrived, they found a stable patient whose emergency had been expertly managed by someone with obvious medical training and quick thinking. They praised Michael's decision to administer the epinephrine, explaining that the timing had been critical and that his intervention had likely prevented a much more serious outcome. Lucy was transported to Millbrook General Hospital for observation and additional treatment, but her condition was no longer life-threatening and the immediate crisis had passed thanks to Michael's willingness to act when action was needed most. The aftermath of the emergency brought unexpected attention to Michael's decisive intervention. Principal Wilson commended his quick thinking and medical expertise, but she also explained that the district office would need to investigate his decision to administer medication without explicit parental consent despite the life-threatening nature of the situation. The school board had policies designed to protect both students and staff, but those policies sometimes created complicated situations when immediate action was required to save a life. Lucy's father, David Chen, arrived at the hospital within hours of being contacted, having chartered a private plane to return from his business trip as quickly as possible. He was a successful technology executive who was accustomed to controlling situations through planning and resources, but his daughter's medical emergency had left him feeling helpless and grateful to the stranger who had stepped in when professional protocols might have caused dangerous delays. The doctors explained that Michael's prompt action had likely prevented serious complications, possibly even saving Lucy's life through his willingness to take personal responsibility for a difficult decision. When David learned that the school custodian who had helped his daughter was being investigated for his life-saving actions, he felt a complex mixture of gratitude and outrage that someone could face professional consequences for doing exactly what needed to be done in a moment of genuine crisis. He requested a meeting with Michael to express his appreciation personally and to ensure that the man who had helped his daughter wouldn't suffer negative consequences for his heroic intervention. Their first conversation took place in the hospital waiting room while Lucy slept peacefully under medical observation, her condition stable and her prognosis excellent thanks to the quick response she'd received. Michael was uncomfortable with being called a hero, explaining that he'd simply done what anyone with medical training would have done in the same situation, that protecting children was part of his job regardless if it involved mopping floors or administering emergency medication. His humility and genuine concern for Lucy's well-being impressed David, who recognized authentic character when he encountered it. The two fathers discussed their daughters, their hopes and fears, their experiences navigating parenthood under different but equally challenging circumstances. Michael spoke about Emma with obvious love and pride,
describing her artistic talents and academic achievements with the enthusiasm of a parent who found joy in his child's growth and development. David shared his struggles with balancing career demands and fatherhood, his guilt about traveling so frequently for business, his worry that his professional success was coming at the cost of meaningful time with his daughter.
Conversation revealed fundamental similarities beneath surface differences of wealth and social status. Both men were devoted fathers who wanted the best for their children, who worried about providing adequate guidance and support, who found meaning and purpose in their roles as parents despite the challenges and sacrifices involved. Michael's willingness to risk his job to save Lucy had demonstrated the kind of character that David respected and admired, the sort of integrity that seemed increasingly rare in his professional and social circles. As Lucy's recovery progressed and the immediate medical crisis passed, the administrative investigation into Michael's actions began to take on a life of its own. District officials were caught between appreciating his life-saving intervention and maintaining policies designed to protect the school system from liability. The situation was complicated by the fact that Michael's decisive action had clearly been necessary and effective, but it had also violated established procedures that existed for legitimate legal and administrative reasons. The investigation would ultimately determine whether Michael's employment would continue, whether his personnel file would reflect commendation or censure, whether his future career prospects would be enhanced or damaged by his willingness to put a child's welfare above institutional protocols. The irony was not lost on him that saving a life might cost him his livelihood, that doing what he knew to be right might result in professional punishment rather than recognition. Part 3. Immediate consequences. The phone call came at 6:23 a.m. on Friday morning, 3 days after Lucy's medical emergency, and 1 day before the weekend Michael had planned to spend helping Emma with her science fair project about renewable energy sources. Principal Wilson's voice carried a formal tone that immediately signaled trouble, requesting his presence in her office before school hours to discuss the results of the district's investigation into his actions during the allergic reaction incident. Michael arrived at Pine Street Elementary 30 minutes early, using the extra time to complete his normal morning safety inspection while trying to maintain the routine that had anchored his life for the past 2 years. The familiar tasks of checking exit doors, testing emergency lighting, and ensuring that walkways were clear and safe felt different this morning, colored by the possibility that this might be among his final days performing these duties that had become central to his identity and sense of purpose. The meeting in Principal Wilson's office included District Superintendent Dr. Patricia Hayes, a woman Michael had never met but whose reputation for strict adherence to policy and procedure was well known throughout the school system. She carried a thick folder containing documentation of the investigation, witness statements, and policy interpretations that would determine his professional future. The fluorescent lights in the office seemed harsher than usual, casting sharp shadows that emphasized the serious nature of the conversation about to unfold. Dr. Hayes began by acknowledging that Michael's actions had undoubtedly saved Lucy Chen's life, and that his medical training and quick thinking had prevented what could have been a tragic outcome. However, she continued, the district had policies in place for very specific reasons, designed to protect both students and employees from the legal and medical complications that could arise when untrained personnel made decisions about emergency medical care. Michael's violation of these policies, regardless of the positive outcome, could not be overlooked or excused without setting a dangerous precedent for future situations. The superintendent explained that the school board had spent considerable time debating Michael's case, weighing his good intentions and successful intervention against the need to maintain clear boundaries around medical decision-making in school settings. Some board members had argued for commendation and policy revision, while others insisted that allowing exceptions to established protocols would create liability issues and undermine the authority of medical professionals. The final decision represented a compromise that satisfied neither those who wanted to reward Michael's heroism nor those who demanded strict enforcement of existing rules. Michael would be suspended without pay for 2 weeks while undergoing additional training about emergency procedures and legal protocols, followed by a formal reprimand that would remain in his personnel file permanently.
Furthermore, he would be prohibited from having any contact with students outside of his normal custodial duties, effectively ending his informal role as a mentor and helper to children who had gravitated toward his kindness and reliability. The punishment was designed to acknowledge both his good intentions and his policy violation, but it felt more like persecution than justice to everyone involved. Principal Wilson had fought against the decision, arguing that Michael's actions represented exactly the kind of character and judgment the district should want in its employees, that punishing someone for saving a child's life sent exactly the wrong message to staff and community members. Her advocacy had prevented a harsher punishment that some board members had initially favored, but it had not been enough to prevent consequences that seemed disproportionate to the alleged offense of protecting a student's welfare.
Old understanding of adult employment was limited, but she grasped enough to realize that their family's stability was being threatened by circumstances beyond her control or comprehension. That evening, Michael sat Emma down for one of the most difficult conversations of his parenting experience, trying to explain adult concepts like workplace policies and administrative decisions in terms a second grader could understand without frightening her unnecessarily. He emphasized that he had helped a sick little girl and that helping people was always the right thing to do, even when it created complications or misunderstandings. Emma's questions were heartbreakingly direct, focused on whether they would have to move again and whether her father would be able to find another job if this one ended badly. The 2-week suspension stretched before them like an unwelcome vacation, time that should have been filled with productive work and steady income, but instead represented a period of uncertainty and financial stress. Michael had been living paycheck to paycheck despite his careful budgeting, and losing 2 weeks of income would require difficult choices about which bills to prioritize and which expenses to eliminate. The timing was particularly challenging because autumn was giving way to winter, bringing higher heating costs and the need for warmer clothing that Emma was rapidly outgrowing. Michael used the first few days of his suspension to research his legal options and understand his rights within the district's disciplinary process. He discovered that appealing the decision would require time and resources he didn't possess, including legal representation that could cost more than he earned in several months. The process was designed to favor the institution over the individual, making it difficult for employees to challenge administrative decisions even when those decisions seemed unfair or disproportionate. The isolation during his suspension was as challenging as the financial consequences, removing him from the school community where he had found purpose and professional satisfaction. The work he had performed was more than just a job. It had been a calling that connected him to the educational mission and the welfare of hundreds of children who depended on safe, clean, well-maintained learning environments. Being separated from that work felt like being exiled from a community where he had finally found his place and identity. Emma's behavior began to reflect the stress and uncertainty that had invaded their previously stable home environment. She became more clingy and anxious, requiring additional reassurance about their future and their security. Her teacher at Riverside Elementary noticed changes in her academic performance and social interactions, the subtle signs that children display when family stress affects their ability to focus on learning and friendship. The ripple effects of Michael's professional crisis were extending into his daughter's life in ways that amplified his guilt and frustration. The community response to news of Michael's suspension was mixed and often based on incomplete or inaccurate information about what had actually happened. Some neighbors and acquaintances expressed support and understanding, recognizing that he had faced an impossible choice between following procedures and saving a life. Others seemed to accept the institutional narrative that suggested wrongdoing, creating an atmosphere of judgment and speculation that made simple activities like grocery shopping or attending Emma's school events uncomfortable and stressful. The local media picked up the story after someone leaked information about the incident to a reporter looking for education-related news, but the coverage focused more on policy debates and administrative procedures than on the human drama of a father trying to provide for his daughter while facing professional consequences for doing what he believed was right.
The article generated online comments and social media discussions that revealed the community's divided opinions about individual responsibility versus institutional authority, but it did little to improve Michael's situation or clarify the facts surrounding his actions.
Academic progress was overshadowed by whispered conversations about her father's professional troubles and what they might indicate about his judgment and reliability. Mrs. Rodriguez, Emma's teacher, found herself in the difficult position of defending both her student and the girl's father while maintaining professional neutrality about a situation involving another school district. She had observed Emma's increased anxiety and social withdrawal since the suspension began, recognizing the signs of a child who was absorbing adult stress and feeling responsible for circumstances beyond her control. The teacher's attempts to provide additional support and reassurance were complicated by the politically charged nature of the situation and the divided opinions within her own professional community. The local coffee shop where Michael had been a regular customer for 2 years became an uncomfortable environment where conversations stopped when he entered and resumed in hushed tones after he left. Baristas, who had previously greeted him warmly, now served him with professional politeness that maintained distance and avoided the friendly small talk that had made the establishment feel welcoming and familiar. The subtle changes in social interaction created a sense of isolation that extended far beyond his workplace suspension. Grocery shopping trips became exercises in social navigation as Michael encountered neighbors, parents from Emma's school, and community members who had formed opinions about his situation based on incomplete information and partisan interpretations. Some offered words of support and encouragement, recognizing his character and the impossible position he had faced during Lucy's medical emergency. Others seemed to avoid eye contact entirely, treating him like someone whose judgment and reliability had been officially questioned by institutional authorities. The hardware store, where Michael had purchased supplies for home maintenance projects and small repairs, became another venue where his presence generated whispered conversations and uncomfortable silences. Store employees, who had previously offered helpful advice and friendly service, now treated him with cautious formality, as if association with someone under disciplinary review might somehow reflect poorly on their own professional reputations. The cumulative effect of these social changes was to make Michael feel like a stranger in the community where he and Emma had been building their new life. Emma's participation in after-school activities became complicated by other parents' concerns about Michael's supervision and judgment. The art class at the community center where she had been developing her creative talents suddenly had a waiting list when it came time for re-enrollment, despite having had open spaces the previous semester. Her invitation to a classmate's birthday party was rescinded with a vague explanation about changing family circumstances and limited space, though Emma could see other children from her class attending the celebration she had been excluded from. The ripple effects extended to professional relationships that had taken years to build and had supported Michael's sense of belonging in Millbrook's business community. The mechanic, who had serviced his aging pickup truck, began to suggest that he might be too busy to fit Michael into his schedule, recommending other shops that might be more convenient. The landlord at Mountain View Apartments, who had previously been flexible about minor lease issues and had appreciated Michael's reliability as a tenant, suddenly became strictly focused on policies and procedures that had never been enforced before. Emma's pediatrician's office began requiring more detailed paperwork and additional documentation for routine appointments, as if Michael's professional situation had somehow called his parenting abilities into question. The medical staff maintained professional courtesy, but the increased scrutiny and additional requirements created the impression that his family was being monitored more closely than other patients, that his judgment about his daughter's healthcare needs was no longer automatically trusted. The public library, where Michael and Emma had spent countless hours reading together and attending educational programs, became another space where their presence generated uncomfortable attention and whispered speculation. Librarians who had previously recommended books and programs enthusiastically now maintained careful professional distance, avoiding the personal connections that had made the library feel like an extension of their home and community. Emma noticed these changes even when she couldn't articulate what was different, sensing that places that had once felt welcoming now carried an undercurrent of judgment and suspicion. Local business owners who had previously chatted with Michael about community events and shared concerns about raising children in a small town now seemed reluctant to engage in personal conversation, keeping interactions focused strictly on commercial transactions. The barber, who had cut his hair and listened to his thoughts about Emma's school progress, now seemed hurried and distracted during appointments, eager to complete the service without the friendly conversation that had made the experience pleasant and relaxing. The cumulative effect of these social changes was to transform Millbrook into a community where Michael and Emma had found acceptance and belonging, into a place where they felt watched, judged, and conditionally tolerated. The suspension from his job had become a mark of suspicion that colored every interaction and relationship, creating a social exile that was perhaps more painful than the professional consequences he was officially facing. Part 5. Collateral damage. The first sign that Emma was bearing the full weight of her father's professional crisis came during a parent-teacher conference that Mrs. Rodriguez had specifically requested to discuss concerning changes in the little girl's behavior and academic performance. Michael sat in the tiny plastic chair designed for 7-year-olds, listening as his daughter's teacher described the transformation that broke his heart and amplified his guilt about the choices he had made during Lucy's medical emergency. Emma, who had always been an enthusiastic participant in class discussions and group activities, had become withdrawn and hesitant to speak in front of her peers. Her artwork, which had previously been filled with bright colors and joyful scenes of family life and childhood adventures, now featured darker themes and anxious imagery that reflected the emotional turmoil she was experiencing at home. Mrs. Rodriguez had observed Emma sitting alone during lunch periods, no longer invited to join the social groups that had
welcomed her earlier in the school year when her father's reputation had been unblemished. The teacher explained that children in Emma's age group were particularly sensitive to adult stress and social dynamics they couldn't fully understand, often internalizing guilt and responsibility for family problems that were completely beyond their control. Emma had apparently been telling classmates that her father was a hero who had saved someone's life, but her passionate defenses were being met with skepticism and contradictory information that the children had absorbed from their parents' conversations about Michael's suspension and alleged policy violations. Most heartbreaking of all, Emma had begun experiencing physical symptoms of anxiety that were affecting her ability to concentrate and learn. She complained of stomach aches during math lessons and had difficulty sleeping, often appearing tired and distracted during morning activities when her mind should have been fresh and ready for learning. Mrs. Rodriguez had noticed Emma checking the classroom clock frequently throughout the day, as if she were worried about time passing or concerned about what might be happening at home while she was at school. The social isolation that Emma was experiencing went far beyond simple exclusion from birthday parties and playgroup activities. Children who had previously sought her out as a friend and creative collaborator now seemed uncertain about whether association with her might somehow reflect poorly on their own social standing within the complex hierarchies that governed elementary school relationships. Emma's teacher had witnessed conversations where other children questioned whether Emma's family was trustworthy, repeating fragments of adult discussions they had overheard but didn't fully comprehend. Michael's attempts to maintain normal family routines and activities were complicated by the financial pressures created by his unpaid suspension and the social difficulties that now accompanied their public appearances. The zoo membership he had purchased at the beginning of the school year as a way to provide Emma with educational entertainment had to be canceled to preserve money for essential expenses. The weekly dinners at Mama Rose's Diner, which had become a cherished tradition for father and daughter, were replaced by home-cooked meals that were more economical but lacked the social atmosphere that had made those outings special. Emma's participation in the community center's art program, which had been a source of joy and creative development, became problematic when other parents began to express concerns about Michael's supervision of children's activities. The program coordinator, caught between supporting a child's artistic development and responding to parent complaints, suggested that Emma might be more comfortable in a different session or perhaps taking a break until the controversy surrounding her father's situation was resolved. The diplomatic language couldn't disguise the fact that Emma was being excluded because of adult conflicts she had no role in creating. The birthday party invitation that was rescinded represented more than just a social disappointment.
It became a symbol of how community judgment was affecting an innocent child who had done nothing wrong. Emma had been looking forward to the celebration for weeks, planning what gifts she would give her classmate and what dress she would wear to the party. When the invitation was withdrawn with a transparent excuse about space limitations, Emma's confusion and hurt were evident in her questions about whether she had done something wrong to make her friend's family not want her at the celebration. The playground dynamics at Riverside Elementary shifted in ways that would have been subtle to adult observers but were painfully obvious to Emma and her peers. Children who had previously included her in their games now seemed hesitant to choose her for teams or invite her to participate in activities during recess periods. The social currency that children trade in questions of trust, belonging, and acceptability had somehow been devalued by her father's professional troubles, making her a less desirable companion through no fault of her own. Emma's questions about their future became more frequent and more specific as she overheard phone conversations and witnessed her father's stress about their financial situation. She asked whether they would have to move away from Millbrook, whether she would have to change schools again, whether her father would be able to find another job if this one ended permanently. Her 7-year-old understanding of adult employment was limited, but she grasped enough to realize that their stability was threatened by circumstances that seemed unfair and confusing. The medical expenses related to Emma's routine health care became more challenging to manage without Michael's regular income, forcing him to request payment plans and extensions that he had never needed before. The pediatric dentist, who had previously been flexible about scheduling and billing, now required advanced payment for services, as if Michael's professional situation had somehow made him a credit risk despite his previously perfect payment history. These small indignities accumulated into a larger pattern of social and economic pressure that affected every aspect of their daily lives. Emma's teacher noticed that the little girl had begun hoarding food during lunch periods, wrapping parts of her sandwich and fruit in napkins to take home rather than eating everything during the designated mealtime. When Mrs. Rodriguez gently asked about this behavior, Emma explained that she wanted to save food in case they ran out at home, demonstrating an awareness of economic insecurity that no 7-year-old should have to carry. The teacher's heart broke as she realized that Emma was trying to help solve family problems by reducing her own consumption and contributing to household resources. The homework assignments that had previously been completed with enthusiasm and creativity now became sources of stress and anxiety as Emma struggled to concentrate while worrying about her father's employment situation and their family's future. Math problems that she had previously solved easily now seemed overwhelming, not because the concepts were too difficult, but because her emotional resources were being consumed by adult concerns that she was trying to understand and help resolve. Michael noticed that Emma had stopped talking about her future dreams and aspirations, no longer discussing her plans to become an artist or her excitement about advancing to the next grade level. Instead, her conversations focused on immediate concerns about whether they would have enough money for groceries, whether she would have to change schools again, whether her father would be able to find another job if this one ended permanently. Her 7-year-old understanding of adult employment was limited, but she grasped enough to realize that their stability was threatened by circumstances that seemed unfair and confusing. The medical expenses related to Emma's routine health care became more challenging to manage without Michael's regular income, forcing him to request payment plans and extensions that he had never needed before. The pediatric dentist, who had previously been flexible about scheduling and billing, now required advanced payment for services, as if Michael's professional situation had somehow made him a credit risk despite his previously perfect payment history.
Father would be able to keep his job, whether they would have to leave the home and community where she had finally begun to feel settled and secure. The transformation from an optimistic, future-oriented child to one consumed by present anxieties represented a loss of innocence that Michael found devastating to witness. The cumulative effect of these pressures was to rob Emma of the carefree childhood experience that Michael had worked so hard to provide after Grace's death. Instead of focusing on learning, creativity, and friendship, Emma was being forced to confront adult realities of economic insecurity,
social judgment, and professional uncertainty that were far beyond her developmental capacity to understand or manage. The child who had thrived during their first 2 years in Millbrook was now struggling under the weight of consequences that stemmed from her father's decision to save another child's life, creating a cruel irony that highlighted the unfairness of institutional policies that punished moral courage and affected innocent family members who had no role in the original decision. The eviction notice arrived on a gray Monday morning in late November, delivered by certified mail that required Michael's signature and left no room for denial or hope that it might be a mistake. The landlord's attorney had composed the document in the formal legal language that transformed human suffering into procedural requirements, giving Michael and Emma exactly 30 days to vacate Mountain View Apartments or face forcible removal through the county sheriff's office. 3 weeks without income had created a cascade of financial obligations that Michael could no longer manage despite his careful budgeting and desperate attempts to stretch every dollar. The rent payment that should have been made on the first of the month had been postponed while he paid for Emma's emergency dental work when she chipped a tooth during a playground accident. The utility bills that had accumulated during his suspension now threatened to cut off their heat and electricity, just as winter weather was beginning to settle over the mountain valleys surrounding Millbrook. Michael sat at their small kitchen table, surrounded by past due notices and final demands, using a calculator with a cracked display to perform arithmetic that never seemed to work in their favor. No matter how many times he rearranged the numbers or revised his projections, the mathematics of poverty remained unforgiving. His savings account, modest to begin with, had been depleted during the first week of suspension when Emma developed strep throat and required antibiotics that their basic health insurance didn't fully cover. The job search that had consumed his days since the suspension began had yielded nothing but polite rejections and uncomfortable silences when potential employers discovered his current employment status. The school district's policy required them to disclose disciplinary actions to anyone conducting reference checks, which meant that Michael's life-saving actions were being reframed as policy violations that raised questions about his judgment and reliability. Even positions for which he was overqualified seemed beyond reach when his most recent supervisor had to report that he was currently under administrative review. Emma found the eviction notice when she came home from school that afternoon, recognizing its official appearance in serious tone even though she couldn't read all the legal terminology. Her 7-year-old understanding of homelessness was limited to images from television and conversations she'd overheard about people who lived in their cars or stayed in shelters, but she grasped enough to realize that their family was facing the loss of the home where they had built their life together in Millbrook. The conversation about their housing crisis was one of the most difficult that Michael had faced as a single parent, requiring him to explain adult concepts like legal proceedings and housing instability to a child who was already struggling with anxiety about their family's future. Emma's questions were heartbreakingly practical, focused on what would happen to her toys and clothes, whether she would be able to finish 2nd grade at Riverside Elementary, whether they would still be able to visit her mother's grave in the Millbrook Cemetery, where they went every month to leave fresh flowers. Michael's attempts to reassure Emma were complicated by his own uncertainty about what options remained available to them. The homeless shelter in the county seat was an hour's drive from Millbrook and had a waiting list that could stretch for weeks during winter months when demand for emergency housing exceeded available space. Moving in with relatives wasn't possible because Michael's parents had died before Emma was born, and Grace's family had never approved of their marriage or shown interest in maintaining relationships after her death. The local food bank, which Michael had occasionally supported with small donations during better times, became a necessary resource as their grocery money was redirected toward keeping their utilities connected long enough to avoid disconnection fees that would make eventual restoration even more expensive. Standing in line with other families facing economic hardship, Michael felt the peculiar shame that accompanies needing help from organizations you had previously supported as a donor rather than a recipient.
Emma's school lunch account had been depleted weeks earlier, forcing Michael to pack increasingly creative meals from their dwindling pantry supplies while trying to ensure that his daughter received adequate nutrition despite their financial constraints. The school's free lunch program required paperwork and processing time that they didn't have, leaving Emma to eat peanut butter sandwiches and crackers while her classmates enjoyed hot meals from the cafeteria, another visible reminder of their family's changed circumstances. The heating bill that arrived during the third week of November represented an impossible choice between keeping their apartment warm enough for Emma's health and saving money for the security deposit they would need to secure new housing. Michael had been keeping the thermostat set at 62 degrees and using extra blankets to manage the cold, but Emma had developed a persistent cough that worsened when the temperature dropped below 60 degrees during nighttime hours. Sleep became increasingly elusive as Michael lay awake calculating and recalculating their financial position, searching for mathematical solutions that didn't exist while listening to Emma's labored breathing in the adjacent bedroom. The stress manifested in physical symptoms that he couldn't afford to address through medical care, including persistent headaches, muscle tension, and a tremor in
His hands that made simple tasks like shaving or signing documents more difficult than they should have been. The truck that had been their reliable transportation for the past 3 years began showing signs of mechanical problems that Michael couldn't afford to repair properly. The alternator was failing intermittently, leaving them stranded twice in grocery store parking lots while Michael performed temporary fixes with tools borrowed from sympathetic mechanics who recognized his competence despite his current financial inability to pay for professional service. Emma's teacher noticed that the little girl was falling asleep during afternoon lessons, a sign that she wasn't getting adequate rest at home despite her regular bedtime schedule. Mrs. Rodriguez discreetly inquired about Emma's sleeping patterns and discovered that the child was staying awake listening to her father's late-night phone calls to potential employers and landlords, absorbing his stress and desperation even when he tried to shield her from the full scope of their crisis. The community resources that might have provided assistance were overwhelmed by demand from other families facing similar crises in an economy that offered few opportunities for workers without college degrees or specialized training. The County Social Services Office had a 3-week waiting list for initial appointments, and their emergency assistance funds had been exhausted by previous applicants who had faced similar housing and employment crises. Michael's pride, which had sustained him through military service and widowhood, became a liability as he struggled to accept help from neighbors and acquaintances who offered assistance. The church, where he and Emma occasionally attended services, had a modest emergency fund for parishioners facing temporary hardship, but accessing those resources required submitting to an assessment process that felt invasive and demeaning to someone who had always been self-sufficient. The psychological weight of potential homelessness created a constant state of anxiety that affected Michael's ability to present himself effectively during job interviews and housing applications. Potential employers noticed his nervousness and distraction, interpreting these stress symptoms as signs of unreliability or incompetence rather than recognizing them as natural responses to economic insecurity and family crisis. Emma's artwork, which had always been a source of joy and creative expression, began reflecting the chaos and uncertainty that had invaded their previously stable home environment. Her drawings featured houses with broken windows, families walking along dark roads carrying suitcases, and children sitting alone in empty rooms surrounded by moving boxes. Mrs. Rodriguez saved these pictures as documentation of a child's response to housing instability, understanding that Emma was processing complex emotions through her artistic expression. The social isolation that had begun with Michael's suspension deepened as their financial crisis became more visible to neighbors and community members.
People who might have offered support were often dealing with their own economic challenges, while those with resources seemed reluctant to become involved in a situation that appeared to have no easy solutions. The combination of professional disgrace and economic desperation created a perfect storm of social exclusion that left the Torres family increasingly alone in their struggle. The countdown toward their eviction date became a daily reminder of how quickly stable circumstances could deteriorate when institutional support systems failed to protect vulnerable families. Michael found himself memorizing the calendar, calculating how many days remained before they would lose their home, while simultaneously trying to maintain hope that some opportunity might emerge to prevent the displacement that seemed increasingly inevitable. Part 7. Dark Night of the Soul. The clock on the kitchen microwave read 3:47 a.m. when Michael finally abandoned any pretense of sleep and made his way to the living room where cardboard boxes stood like silent monuments to their impending displacement. 18 days remained until the eviction deadline, and despite his exhaustive efforts to find alternative housing or restore his income, every avenue seemed to lead toward the same inevitable conclusion. Emma slept fitfully in her bedroom, her breathing interrupted by the stress-induced cough that had persisted for weeks despite his careful attention to keeping their apartment as warm as their dwindling resources would allow. The November wind rattled the windows of Mountain View apartments with a persistence that seemed to mock his inability to provide adequate shelter for his daughter. Michael wrapped Grace's old quilted robe around his shoulders and settled into the worn armchair where he had spent countless peaceful evenings reading bedtime stories to Emma during happier times when their future had seemed secure and predictable. Tonight, the familiar furniture felt like artifacts from someone else's life, reminders of a stability that had proved more fragile than he had ever imagined possible. The letter from Grace that he kept folded in his wallet had become worn soft from handling during these sleepless vigils, its edges frayed from being unfolded and reread whenever he needed to remember why he had chosen to help Lucy Chen despite the potential consequences. Grace had written it during her final weeks in the hospital, when they both knew she was dying but still maintained the gentle fiction that her advice might guide him through normal parenting challenges rather than the complete reconstruction of their family life around an absence that would never stop aching. In her careful handwriting, Grace had emphasized the importance of teaching Emma that character was measured by choices made when no one was watching, that true integrity required helping others even when doing so created personal difficulties or sacrifices. She had written about the kind of man she hoped Michael would continue to be after her death, someone who would show their daughter through his actions that kindness and compassion were not luxuries to be discarded during difficult times, but essential values that defined what it meant to be fully human. Reading Grace's words in the darkness of their threatened home, Michael felt the full weight of how completely his attempt to honor her memory had backfired. His decision to save Lucy's life was motivated by exactly the principles Grace had articulated, but the consequences had created the very instability and insecurity she had feared most for Emma's childhood. The cruel irony was that following his wife's moral guidance had led directly to circumstances that would have horrified her, placing their daughter in jeopardy through the same compassionate instincts Grace had wanted him to preserve.
Across the coffee table showed Emma's progression from a grief-stricken 4-year-old clinging to her father's uniform at Grace's funeral to the confident, artistic 7-year-old she had become during their 2 years in Millbrook. The transformation documented in those images represented Michael's greatest achievement as a single parent, proof that he had managed to create stability and joy for his daughter, despite the devastating loss that had reshaped their family. Now that same child was exhibiting signs of anxiety and insecurity that reminded him painfully of her behavior immediately after Grace's death. The medical bills from Grace's final months of treatment remained in a file folder that Michael had kept meaning to organize, but never found the emotional strength to face completely. The insurance company had covered most of the major expenses, but the accumulation of deductibles, co-payments, and uncovered services had created debts that continued to affect his credit rating 3 years after her death. Those financial obligations, combined with their current housing crisis, made it nearly impossible to qualify for rental properties that required security deposits and demonstrated income stability. Michael's military service in Afghanistan seemed like a lifetime ago, though the skills he had learned during deployment continued to serve him in civilian life. The medical training that had enabled him to save Lucy's life had been acquired during a tour of duty that had taught him to make life-or-death decisions under pressure, to prioritize human welfare over procedural compliance when circumstances demanded immediate action. The same instincts that had kept his fellow soldiers alive in combat situations had prompted his intervention during Lucy's allergic reaction, but the institutional response had been utterly different in a school setting where liability concerns outweighed appreciation for effective emergency response. The nightmares that had plagued Michael during his first months after returning from deployment had largely subsided during his years with Grace and Emma, but they had returned with new intensity during the stress of his suspension and housing crisis. Sleep brought dreams where he was simultaneously trying to save Lucy's life and protect Emma from some undefined threat, scenarios where every choice led to catastrophic consequences and where his efforts to help others resulted in harm to the people he loved most. The unemployment benefits that might have provided temporary financial relief were unavailable because Michael had been suspended rather than laid off, a distinction that eliminated his eligibility for assistance despite the involuntary nature of his income loss. The bureaucratic categories that determined access to support services didn't account for situations where employees faced discipline for actions that were morally justified but procedurally problematic, leaving families like the Torres in administrative limbo where they were too employed to qualify for unemployment benefits but too suspended to earn the income they needed for survival. Emma's questions about their situation had become increasingly sophisticated as she absorbed adult conversations and overheard phone calls that revealed the scope of their crisis. She had asked whether they would become homeless like the people she had seen on television, whether she would have to change schools again, whether her father's job troubles meant that helping people was wrong after all. Michael's answers required him to navigate complex moral territory where doing the right thing had created terrible consequences, where adult responsibilities conflicted with childhood needs for security and stability. The small notebook where Michael tracked their expenses had become a catalog of impossible choices and deferred necessities. Emma needed new winter boots because her feet had grown since the previous year, but purchasing them would require money needed for gasoline to drive to job interviews. The prescription for her cough medicine cost $43 that could otherwise buy groceries for 4 days, forcing Michael to choose between his daughter's immediate comfort and their slightly longer-term nutritional needs. The phone calls from debt collectors had become a daily reminder of how quickly financial stability could deteriorate when income disappeared and expenses continued to accumulate. Michael had stopped answering calls from numbers he didn't recognize, allowing voicemails to pile up with increasingly urgent demands for payments he simply couldn't make. The stress of constant financial pressure created a feedback loop where his anxiety about money made it more difficult to perform well during job interviews, which reduced his chances of finding employment that could restore their economic stability. The community that had seemed so welcoming during their first 2 years in Millbrook now felt like a collection of strangers who viewed their family's crisis with suspicion rather than sympathy. Michael understood that other families were facing their own challenges and couldn't be expected to solve problems they hadn't created, but the isolation was complete and devastating. Even the librarians who had previously greeted Emma warmly now seemed to watch them carefully, as if financial instability might be contagious or might lead to behaviors that could damage books or disturb other patrons.
The calendar on their refrigerator, where Michael had once marked Emma's school events in his work schedule with optimistic planning, now counted down toward their eviction date with mathematical precision. Each day that passed without finding new employment or alternative housing brought them closer to a displacement that would affect every aspect of Emma's life, from her education to her friendships to her sense of security in a world that was supposed to protect children from adult failures and institutional cruelties. In the pre-dawn darkness of their threatened home, Michael finally understood the full cost of his decision to save Lucy Chen's life. The choice itself remained morally clear and personally justified, but its consequences had created exactly the kind of instability and trauma that Grace had feared most for Emma's childhood without her protective presence. Part 8. Memory of Purpose. The sunrise filtering through their apartment windows on the morning of November 28th marked exactly 1 month since Lucy Chen's medical emergency and Michael's life-altering decision to administer the EpiPen that had saved her life. Emma was still sleeping peacefully in her bedroom, unaware that this would be one of their final mornings in the home where they had built their life together in Millbrook.
11 days, they would be forced to leave Mountain View Apartments with nowhere definitive to go. But this morning, Michael found himself thinking not about their uncertain future, but about the afternoon that had changed everything. Grace's jewelry box sat on their dresser, exactly where she had left it 3 years earlier, its contents undisturbed except for the wedding ring that Michael wore on a chain around his neck and the small silver locket that Emma sometimes borrowed for special occasions. Inside the box, beneath Grace's modest collection of earrings and bracelets, lay the letter she had written to him during her final hospital stay, but also something else he hadn't looked at in months. A photograph of Grace volunteering at the Children's Hospital in Portland, reading stories to young patients whose illnesses had interrupted their normal childhoods and created unexpected needs for comfort and distraction. The picture had been taken during Grace's weekly visits to the pediatric oncology ward, where she had spent 3 years bringing books and art supplies to children whose medical treatments required long hospitalizations away from their families and familiar environments. Grace had never spoken about these visits as charity work or volunteer service. To her, they had simply been opportunities to share stories and creativity with children who needed both, to provide human connection during medical experiences that could feel isolating and frightening. Michael remembered how Grace had described those hospital visits, her excitement about the children's progress in their artistic projects, and their enthusiasm for the stories she brought each week. She had talked about a 6-year-old boy named Marcus who had been learning to draw superhero characters during his chemotherapy treatments, and a 9-year-old girl named Isabella who had written her own stories about magical adventures that took place in hospital rooms transformed into fantasy kingdoms. Grace's descriptions had always focused on what the children were teaching her rather than what she was giving them, her recognition that every act of service created reciprocal relationships where both giver and receiver experienced transformation. Those hospital visits had been Grace's way of putting into practice the philosophy she had tried to articulate in her final letter to Michael, her belief that human connection and compassion were not abstract ideals, but practical responses to the immediate needs that surrounded them every day. She had never seen her volunteer work as heroic or exceptional. It had simply been one way among many to recognize that everyone carried burdens that could be lightened through simple acts of attention and care. The children in that pediatric ward had been strangers to Grace when she first began volunteering, but they had become part of her extended family through the relationships that developed over shared stories and creative projects. Some of them had recovered completely and returned to normal childhoods where hospital visits became distant memories. Others had not survived their illnesses despite the medical expertise and technological resources available to them.
Grace had learned to hold both outcomes with equal acceptance, understanding that her role was to provide love and connection during whatever time was available, rather than to control medical outcomes that were beyond her influence. Lucy Chen had been a stranger to Michael when she collapsed in Mrs. Patterson's kindergarten classroom, but in that moment of medical crisis, she had become exactly the kind of child that Grace had spent years serving in hospital settings. The allergic reaction that threatened Lucy's life had created the same urgent need for competent adult intervention that Grace had witnessed countless times during her volunteer work with hospitalized children. Michael's decision to administer the EpiPen had been motivated by the same instincts that had driven Grace to spend her Saturdays reading stories to sick children who needed someone to care about their welfare. The photograph showed Grace surrounded by children of various ages, all of them engaged in creative projects that had temporarily distracted them from their medical treatments and hospital routines. Her expression in the picture reflected the same joy that Michael had seen on her face when she was reading bedtime stories to Emma or helping their daughter with art projects that required adult assistance with scissors or glue. Grace possessed a natural ability to connect with children who were facing difficult circumstances, to provide exactly the kind of attention and encouragement they needed without making them feel pitied or different. Michael realized that his intervention during Lucy's emergency had been guided by the same values that had motivated Grace's hospital volunteering: the recognition that children in crisis deserved immediate, competent care from whatever adults were present and capable of helping. The school policies that had led to his suspension would have prevented Grace from helping the hospitalized children she had served so faithfully, would have required her to defer to institutional procedures, even when delay could cause unnecessary suffering or missed opportunities for connection and healing. The letter that Grace had written during her final weeks contained specific instructions about the values she hoped Michael would teach Emma through his example, but it also included a passage about the importance of trusting moral instincts, even when they conflicted with social expectations or institutional requirements. Grace had written about the danger of allowing bureaucratic thinking to override human compassion, about the risk of becoming so focused on procedural compliance that fundamental ethical obligations were ignored or deferred to inappropriate authorities. Lucy's artistic talents, which had flourished during their time in Millbrook, were directly inherited from Grace's creative spirit and her belief that imagination could transform difficult circumstances into opportunities for growth and learning. The drawings that Emma had created during our current crisis reflected not just anxiety about their housing situation, but also her attempts to process complex emotions through visual expression, exactly as Grace had taught her to do during the grief that followed her mother's death. The children's book that Grace had been writing during her illness remained unfinished in a folder in their bedroom closet, its story about a young girl who helped other children through acts of kindness and creativity that seemed small but created expanding circles of positive change. Grace had intended to dedicate the book to Emma, hoping that it would someday remind our daughter that individual actions mattered even when their effects weren't immediately visible, that character was built through daily choices to help rather than harm, to include rather than
exclude, to create rather than destroy. Michael understood now that his decision to help Lucy had been guided by the same moral compass that had inspired Grace's volunteer work and her approach to parenting: the belief that children's welfare took precedence over adult comfort or institutional convenience. The suspension and financial crisis that had resulted from his actions were painful consequences, but they didn't invalidate the ethical foundation that had motivated his choice to administer life-saving medication when procedural compliance would have meant watching a child suffer or possibly die. The community response to their family's crisis had revealed both the limitations and the possibilities of human compassion in difficult circumstances. Some neighbors and acquaintances had offered support and understanding, recognizing that Michael's situation resulted from moral courage rather than professional incompetence. Others had allowed institutional narratives to override their personal knowledge of his character,
demonstrating how easily fear and judgment could replace empathy and critical thinking when communities faced complex situations that didn't fit simple categories. Emma's resilience during their current difficulties reflected Grace's influence as much as Michael's parenting, her mother's teaching that challenges could become opportunities for growth when approached with creativity and determination rather than defeat and despair. Even as their family faced displacement and economic insecurity, Emma continued to create artwork that transformed their small apartment into a gallery of imagination and hope, maintaining the creative spirit that Grace had considered essential to meaningful life. The sunrise that morning brought not just another day closer to their eviction deadline, but also a renewed understanding of why Michael's intervention during Lucy's emergency had been necessary and right, regardless of its personal consequences. Grace's example had taught him that moral integrity required accepting the costs of doing right, rather than calculating whether good actions would be rewarded or punished by institutional authorities whose priorities might not align with fundamental human values. Part 9. The Unexpected Sign. The envelope appeared on their doorstep on the morning of December 1st, exactly 8 days before their scheduled eviction, delivered not by regular mail, but placed carefully beside their welcome mat by someone who had come and gone without ringing the doorbell or leaving any trace of their identity. The envelope was expensive-looking, made of heavy, cream-colored paper that felt substantial in Michael's hands, and it bore no return address or postmark, only his name written in elegant handwriting that suggested education and careful attention to correspondence. Inside the envelope, wrapped in tissue paper that had been folded with obvious care, Michael found a small silver charm bracelet that seemed to shimmer with its own light, despite the gray December morning filtering through their living room windows. Each charm on the bracelet told a part of what appeared to be a story, beginning with a tiny house and progressing through symbols that represented family, service, sacrifice, and hope. The craftsmanship was exquisite, clearly the work of someone who understood jewelry as art rather than mere decoration. Beneath the bracelet lay a handwritten letter on matching paper, composed in the same elegant script that had addressed the envelope. The message was brief but profound, written by someone who had taken considerable time to choose each word with precision and care. The writer thanked Michael for his kindness to their daughter during her medical emergency, explaining that his willingness to act when others hesitated had not only saved Lucy's life, but had also restored their family's faith in human goodness during a period when cynicism and disappointment had threatened to overwhelm their capacity for trust. The letter described how Lucy had spoken repeatedly about the man who had helped her breathe again during the most frightening experience of her young life, how she had begun referring to Michael as her guardian angel, despite never having learned his name or seen him after that day in the kindergarten classroom. Her parents had tried to explain that he was simply a school employee who had been trained in emergency medical procedures, but Lucy insisted that angels sometimes appeared as ordinary people who helped when help was needed most, and that her helper had possessed exactly the kind of gentle strength that angels were supposed to have. The writer continued by explaining that Lucy's allergic reaction had been triggered by a new food product that had been introduced into the school snack program without adequate labeling about potential allergens. The incident had prompted a complete review of the district's emergency medical procedures and had resulted in policy changes that would better protect students with serious allergies while empowering trained personnel to respond effectively during medical crises. Michael's decision to administer the EpiPen had not only saved Lucy's life, but had also prevented similar situations from occurring in the future. Most significantly, the letter revealed that Lucy's father, David Chen, had been quietly investigating Michael's situation and had learned about the suspension, financial difficulties, and impending eviction that had resulted from his life-saving intervention. The family had been horrified to discover that the man who had saved their daughter was facing professional and personal consequences for his heroic actions, and they were determined to ensure that his kindness would not result in his family's displacement or continued hardship. The letter explained that David Chen owned several rental properties in Millbrook, including a modest but comfortable house on Maple Street that had recently become available and would be perfect for a small family seeking a fresh start.
The house came with a yard where a 7-year-old could play safely, sufficient space for creative projects and homework, and a location that would allow Emma to continue attending Riverside Elementary without disruption to her education or friendships. Furthermore, the letter continued, David had been impressed by Michael's background in maintenance and facilities management, skills that were exactly what his growing technology company needed as they expanded their operations in Millbrook. The position would involve maintaining their office building and coordinating facility services for their growing staff, work that would utilize Michael's experience while providing a stable income that could support his family's needs and future aspirations.
Benefit that would provide David's company with reliable, competent facility management while giving Michael the chance to rebuild his life in the community where he and Emma had already established roots. The salary would be sufficient to cover the rent on the Maple Street house, Emma's medical expenses, and the modest luxuries that made childhood more enjoyable and secure. Lucy had insisted on selecting the charm bracelet personally, the letter explained, choosing each symbol to represent different aspects of the story that connected their families. The house charm represented the home that Michael had created for Emma despite difficult circumstances. The family charm acknowledged the love that bound father and daughter together through challenges that would have overwhelmed many people. The service charm honored Michael's commitment to helping others even when such help created personal difficulties. The sacrifice charm recognized what Michael had given up to save Lucy's life, while the hope charm represented the future that was still possible when good people supported each other through difficult times. Lucy had wanted Michael and Emma to have something beautiful that would remind them that their kindness had created lasting positive change, that their temporary struggles were not the end of their story, but simply a difficult chapter in a longer narrative that was still being written. The letter was signed by both David and his wife, Jennifer Chen, with a postscript in a child's careful handwriting that read, "Thank you for helping me breathe. You are my guardian angel. Love, Lucy." Below Lucy's message was a small drawing of an angel with work clothes and a kind smile, obviously meant to represent Michael in his custodial uniform, transformed into something celestial through a 6-year-old's understanding of heroism and divine intervention. Michael read the letter 3 times before its full implications sank in, each reading revealing new layers of generosity and understanding that addressed not only their immediate crisis, but also their longer-term needs for stability and community belonging. The offer represented more than just employment and housing. It was recognition that his decision to help Lucy had been morally correct, despite its professional consequences. Validation that character mattered more than compliance with policies that prioritized institutional protection over human welfare. Emma found the letter when she returned from school that afternoon, her face lighting up with the first genuine smile Michael had seen from her in weeks as she read Lucy's message and examined the charm bracelet that sparkled in the late afternoon sunlight streaming through their living room windows. For the first time since his suspension began, Emma spoke excitedly about their future rather than anxiously about their immediate problems, asking whether they would really get to live in a house with a yard and whether her father would really have a job that appreciated his skills rather than punishing him for using them. The timing of the letter's arrival seemed miraculous, coming exactly when their situation appeared most hopeless and their options most limited. 8 days before their eviction deadline, when Michael had been preparing to tell Emma that they might need to live in their truck temporarily while searching for emergency shelter, the Chen family had provided not just a solution to their immediate crisis, but a pathway toward rebuilding their life in Millbrook with dignity and hope. That evening, Michael called the phone number included in the letter and had his first conversation with David Chen since their brief meeting at the hospital during Lucy's recovery. David's voice carried genuine warmth and respect as he explained that the offer was sincere and immediate, that the house on Maple Street was available for occupancy within days, and that Michael could begin his new position as soon as he was ready to start working again. The conversation revealed that David had spent considerable time researching Michael's background, speaking with teachers and parents who had observed his work at Pine Street Elementary,
gathering testimony about his character and competence from people who had witnessed his dedication to creating safe, clean learning environments for children. The suspension had been noted, but understood in its proper context, recognized as institutional overreaction rather than legitimate cause for concern about Michael's judgment or reliability. As Michael tucked Emma into bed that night, she held the charm bracelet carefully in her small hands, examining each symbol in the glow of her bedside lamp while asking questions about guardian angels and whether they really appeared as ordinary people who helped when help was needed most. Michael found himself able to answer her questions with confidence and hope for the first time in weeks, explaining that angels were indeed often disguised as regular people who chose to help others, even when helping created difficulties for themselves.
Proceedings. Beside him sat a woman Michael didn't recognize, though her professional attire and the briefcase at her feet suggested she might be an attorney. Lucy herself was not present, but her influence permeated the room through the stack of letters and drawings that lay before her father, testimony from a 6-year-old who had transformed a controversial disciplinary action into a community debate about values and priorities. Dr. Hayes, the district superintendent, opened the meeting by explaining that new information had come to light regarding Michael's case, information that had prompted the board to reconsider their previous decision and examine whether their disciplinary policies adequately served the district's educational mission and community values. The investigation that had seemed concluded just days earlier was being reopened based on evidence that Michael's actions had prevented not only immediate harm to Lucy, but potentially devastating liability for the school district. Mrs. Patterson spoke first among the community members, her voice steady despite the obvious emotion underlying her words. She described the afternoon of Lucy's allergic reaction with the precision of someone who had relived those moments countless times, emphasizing how quickly the situation had deteriorated and how Michael's intervention had been the only thing standing between a frightened child and a potentially fatal outcome. Her testimony included medical documentation from Lucy's treating physician, confirming that the delay required by standard procedures would likely have resulted in more severe complications requiring extensive hospitalization and possibly permanent neurological damage. Dr. Martinez followed with a detailed explanation of anaphylactic shock and the critical importance of immediate epinephrine administration in severe allergic reactions. She had reviewed Lucy's case at David Chen's request and could state definitively that Michael's quick action had not only saved the child's life, but had prevented complications that could have resulted in cognitive impairment or other lasting disabilities. The delay that would have been required to contact parents and obtain formal consent could have meant the difference between complete recovery and permanent injury. The pediatrician's testimony was particularly damaging to the district's position because it came from a medical professional with no personal stake in Michael's employment situation. Dr. Martinez explained that school policies requiring parental consent for emergency medication administration were appropriate for non-life-threatening situations, but became dangerous when applied to true medical emergencies where minutes could determine outcomes. Michael's military medical training had enabled him to recognize the severity of Lucy's condition and respond appropriately when procedural compliance would have been medically contraindicated. David Chen's presentation focused not on medical details, but on the broader implications of the district's disciplinary action. His investigation had revealed that other school districts in the region had faced similar situations and had responded by commending employees who demonstrated competent emergency response rather than punishing them for policy violations. The liability exposure created by punishing life-saving actions was potentially enormous, particularly when that punishment could discourage other employees from providing necessary assistance during future emergencies. The attorney accompanying David introduced herself as Amanda Rodriguez, a specialist in educational law who had reviewed Michael's case pro bono after being contacted by concerned parents. Her legal analysis demonstrated that the district's current policies created a dangerous contradiction between their duty to protect students and their procedures for emergency medical care.
The disciplinary action against Michael had actually increased their legal vulnerability while sending a message that could prevent future life-saving interventions by staff members who feared professional consequences for helping students in crisis. The stack of letters from parents, teachers, and community members represented voices that had not been heard during the original investigation. Testimony about Michael's character and competence that painted a picture dramatically different from the policy violator described in official disciplinary documents. Emma's teacher from Riverside Elementary had written about the positive changes she had observed in Emma's confidence and academic performance since moving to Millbrook, attributing much of that progress to the stable, loving home environment that Michael had created as a single father. Neighbors from Mountain View Apartments described Michael's reliability and helpfulness, his willingness to assist elderly residents with maintenance tasks, and his informal mentoring of other single parents who were struggling to balance work and family responsibilities. The church where he and Emma occasionally attended services had contributed a letter from their pastor, describing Michael's quiet volunteer work with their food pantry and his donations of time and labor to maintain their community garden that provided fresh vegetables for local families in need. Perhaps most significantly, several teachers from Pine Street Elementary had submitted statements describing how the school had operated more smoothly and safely since Michael's arrival, how his attention to detail and proactive maintenance had prevented accidents and created an environment where education could flourish. The custodial staff from other schools in the district had written collectively to support their colleague, explaining that Michael's reputation for competence and reliability was well known throughout the maintenance community and that his suspension had been viewed with dismay by people who understood the difference between exceptional performance and mere policy compliance. Lucy's own contribution to the proceedings came through a series of drawings that depicted the afternoon of her allergic reaction from her 6-year-old perspective. The picture showed her fear and confusion during the medical emergency, followed by relief and gratitude when the man in work clothes helped her breathe again. Her artistic interpretation of Michael as a guardian angel was not sophisticated, but it captured something essential about the experience that adult testimony might have missed: the profound impact that competent, compassionate care could have on a child who was frightened and in pain. The school board members listened to this testimony with growing discomfort as it became clear that their disciplinary action was not only legally questionable, but also morally indefensible. Board President Janet Walsh, who had initially supported strict enforcement of existing policies,
found herself questioning whether those policies served the district's actual mission of educating and protecting children. The weight of community opinion was clearly shifting toward recognizing Michael's actions as heroic rather than problematic, creating political pressure that complemented the legal and ethical arguments being presented. Dr. Hayes acknowledged that the new information raised serious questions about the appropriateness of Michael's suspension and the adequacy of current emergency medical procedures. However, she also emphasized that the district had acted in good faith based on the policies and information available at the time, and that any changes to their decision would need to be carefully considered to avoid setting precedents that could complicate future disciplinary actions. The superintendent's comments suggested institutional resistance to admitting error, even when that error had caused significant harm to an employee who deserved commendation rather than punishment. The tension in the room was palpable, as community members realized that legal arguments and moral clarity might not be sufficient to overcome institutional inertia and administrative face-saving. The school board appeared to be searching for a way to reverse their decision without acknowledging that it had been wrong in the first place, a political calculation that prioritized organizational reputation over individual justice. The community members who had invested time and effort in supporting Michael's case watched with frustration as procedural concerns threatened to override substantive arguments about right and wrong. Amanda Rodriguez addressed this reluctance directly, explaining that the district's legal exposure would only increase if they maintained a disciplinary action that was clearly inappropriate and potentially discriminatory. Her research had identified several similar cases where school districts had faced expensive lawsuits after punishing employees for life-saving actions, and she was prepared to pursue all available legal remedies if Michael's situation was not resolved fairly and promptly. The attorney's measured but firm tone suggested that the district's options were narrowing, and that continued resistance would only escalate the controversy. The media presence outside the building added another layer of pressure to the proceedings, as reporters waited for information about a story that had captured public attention through social media coverage and word-of-mouth advocacy. The contrast between a heroic custodian being punished for saving a child's life and the bureaucratic policies that had enabled such an injustice made for compelling journalism that could damage the district's reputation if not handled appropriately. The school board's deliberations were taking place under scrutiny that made political considerations as important as legal and educational factors. Michael found himself at the center of a controversy he had never sought, watching as his personal crisis became a public debate about institutional priorities and community values. The support from parents, teachers, and neighbors was gratifying but also overwhelming, transforming his quiet struggle for justice into a cause that demanded public statements and media attention. He appreciated the advocacy, but also felt uncomfortable with the spotlight, preferring to focus on providing for Emma rather than becoming a symbol of broader social or educational issues. The morning's proceedings concluded with the school board announcing that they would deliberate privately before making a final decision about Michael's case, taking into consideration all the new testimony and legal analysis that had been presented. The timeline for their decision remained unclear, but the pressure from community members and media attention suggested that a resolution would come quickly. Michael left the meeting with cautious optimism, but also with an awareness that bureaucratic institutions sometimes chose self-protection over justice, even when the moral clarity of a situation was overwhelming.
Affected not only Michael, but also his young daughter and the broader school community that had been deprived of his competent service. Dr. Hayes opened the proceedings with an acknowledgement that the district's initial response to Michael's actions had been inappropriate and had failed to recognize the life-saving nature of his intervention during Lucy's allergic reaction. Her statement carefully avoided accepting full responsibility for the institutional failures that had led to his suspension, but it clearly established that Michael had acted heroically rather than problematically during the medical emergency. The superintendent's words carried the weight of official recognition, transforming Michael from a disciplined employee into a commended hero. Principal Wilson followed with a more personal and emotional tribute to Michael's character and competence, describing the positive changes that Pine Street Elementary had experienced since his arrival and the ways that his suspension had affected school operations and staff morale. Her testimony emphasized that Michael's quick thinking during Lucy's emergency was entirely consistent with the careful attention to student safety that characterized all aspects of his work. The principal's advocacy had been crucial during the darkest moments of his professional crisis, and her public vindication represented both personal validation and institutional recognition of his value to the educational community. Mrs. Patterson, the kindergarten teacher who had witnessed Lucy's allergic reaction, provided the most compelling testimony of the evening, as she described the medical emergency from her perspective as an educator who had been responsible for the child's safety but lacked the training necessary to provide effective intervention. Her voice trembled with emotion as she explained how terrifying it had been to watch Lucy's condition deteriorate while waiting for emergency medical services, and how grateful she remained to Michael for taking decisive action when delay could have resulted in tragedy. The teacher's testimony included a detailed description of Lucy's symptoms and the speed with which they had progressed, information that made clear to everyone present that Michael had faced a true life-or-death decision rather than a routine policy question.
Mrs. Patterson emphasized that she would never forget the relief she had felt when Michael arrived in her classroom and immediately began providing the competent medical care that Lucy needed, demonstrating exactly the kind of professional expertise and personal courage that schools needed from their staff members. Lucy herself was invited to speak, though her contribution was brief and delivered in the shy voice of a 6-year-old who was not entirely comfortable with public attention. She thanked Michael for helping her breathe and for being her guardian angel, presenting him with the drawing she had created specifically for the occasion. Her simple words carried more emotional weight than any adult testimony, reminding everyone present that the controversy had ultimately been about protecting a frightened child who had needed immediate help from a competent adult. The formal commendation that Dr. Hayes presented to Michael recognized his extraordinary courage, professional competence, and selfless dedication to student welfare during a life-threatening medical emergency. Their certificate was accompanied by a monetary award that would help offset some of the financial hardship his family had experienced during the suspension, though no amount of money could fully compensate for the stress and uncertainty they had endured. The official recognition was meaningful not just for its acknowledgement of Michael's heroism, but also for its clear message that the district valued employees who prioritized student safety over procedural compliance. David Chen addressed the gathering as a parent whose daughter's life had been saved by Michael's intervention, speaking about the profound gratitude that he and his family felt toward the man who had acted decisively when others might have hesitated. His testimony emphasized that Michael's heroism was not diminished by the institutional difficulties it had created, and that the Chen family would always consider themselves fortunate that their daughter's medical emergency had occurred in a place where someone with medical training was willing to take personal risks to save a child's life. The businessman's presentation included an announcement that his technology company was establishing a scholarship fund in Michael's honor, providing financial assistance for children of school district employees who pursued careers in education, emergency medical services, or other fields focused on helping others. The scholarship represented David's belief that Michael's example should inspire others to choose careers that prioritized service and compassion, creating a lasting legacy that would extend far beyond the immediate resolution of his employment situation. Emma was invited to join her father at the podium as he accepted his commendation, her small hand holding his as he spoke briefly about the importance of helping others, even when such help created personal difficulties. Michael's remarks were characteristically humble, emphasizing that his actions during Lucy's emergency had simply reflected the values that any parent would want demonstrated toward their own child in similar circumstances. He thanked the community members who had supported his family during their most difficult weeks, acknowledging that their advocacy had been crucial in achieving the positive resolution they were celebrating. The evening concluded with the announcement of new district policies that would ensure future emergency medical situations would be handled more effectively, with trained personnel empowered to provide immediate care without bureaucratic delays that could endanger student welfare. Michael's case had prompted a comprehensive review of emergency procedures that would benefit all students and families in the district, creating systemic changes that would prevent other families from experiencing similar crises when school employees responded appropriately to medical emergencies. The media coverage of the evening's events would ultimately reach beyond Millbrook to inspire similar policy reviews in school districts throughout the region, demonstrating how one person's moral courage could create positive changes that extended far beyond their immediate community. Michael's story became a case study in the importance of empowering trained personnel to respond to emergencies, and his example encouraged other school employees to prioritize student welfare over institutional protocols when faced with life-threatening situations. As the gymnasium emptied and families returned to their evening routines, Michael
found himself surrounded by parents, teachers, and community members who wanted to express their personal gratitude for his service and their relief at his vindication.
The conversations were warm, but also carried undertones of regret that such support had not been available during the weeks when he and Emma had struggled alone with the consequences of his heroic actions. The community recognition was meaningful, but it also highlighted how institutional failures could isolate individuals who deserved support rather than punishment. The drive home with Emma that evening was filled with her excited chatter about the ceremony and her pride in her father's recognition, but also with her relief that their life in Millbrook could continue without the uncertainty and fear that had dominated recent weeks. The 7-year-old's perspective on the evening's events was simpler than the adult understanding of institutional politics and legal complexities, focused on the basic truth that her father was a good person who helped other people and deserved to be treated with respect and appreciation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.